Well, we've waited a couple of minutes afterwards. I think we're going to get started, and as people trickle in, so be it. Yeah, so I am Marc Kelly. I'm a lawyer here in Regina. I have been practicing law since about 2006, with a good chunk of that being involved with supporting condominium corporations and dealing with a lot of residential related transactions. So I got involved years ago with kind of a condo foreclosure, and after a bunch of hours and time volunteering and educating condo owners, I'm still participating in the community as much as I can. And I know Jamie is as well. Jamie, if you just want to give a brief introduction, please.
So my name is Jamie Herle. I'm a lawyer in Saskatoon. I practice at Cullen-Air. I'm a partner here, and what I do predominantly now is condo law. I started in 2004 and was asked to tag along with one of the partners at my firm in Regina to present on a small condo issue to a group of condo owners at CCI. And 15 years later, now I would say a large chunk of my practice focuses on condo law, and that's what I spend a lot of my day doing.
Great, awesome. So why you guys are all here, not to look at my ever so lovely COVID head. I'm just going to share here the presentation that we've got. There it is. So with it, we're going to go through a number of issues. I suspect that some of your questions might be answered through it, but if they're not, like I say, provide us with a question. We'll be looking at them at the end. There's been a number of people who've reached out to me directly as the organizer to just give me some ideas of some issues. We're going to talk about probably a lot of the things that you've identified, and we'll go forward from there. So agenda, I guess maybe even before we get into that, just a note, we have been dealing with this on the fly just as much as every other area has been dealing with this on the fly. So this is kind of as far as we can tell right now. As we've been seeing, these things have changed so frequently on kind of various issues that we're just kind of responding to it as we can. So, you know, we'll try to do our best to continue to educate, but we think that this is a good starting point. So, what we're going to talk about today, one, AGMs. We know that a number of people are heading into the AGM kind of season, and we want to make sure that we've talked about some of your requirements with them, and if you can avoid them, great, and if you can't, or if you don't think you can, we'll talk a little bit about that. Money is going to be tight, so condo fees have become a bit of an issue. We're going to talk about what some of the rights and obligations are with respect to that. We want to give you some ideas around estoppel certificates and what you need to do to be managing some of the things that might create change for your condominium corporation by disclosing them through your estoppel certificates. So give that some thought. We are not expert social distancers. We are not expert cleaners, but we have, so to the extent that we can provide any advice on sanitation practices, I'm talking more about kind of your obligations. How you execute those obligations are going to be more about you kind of looking for reputable information sources about cleaning and distancing and all those sorts of things. So we'll talk about those things. So, and then lastly, just information sharing. So kind of generally what can you can't do associated with sharing information within your board and within your community. And like I said, we'll talk a bit about that. Jamie.
So I'm going to start with AGMs. The message, the biggest message right now, and what we're hearing and what we're seeing is social distancing. So we have been mandated, it's come down from all levels of government now that we should be social distancing. So social distancing is minimizing close contact with others in the community. That goes down to your condo corporation as well. So you shouldn't be meeting together to play cards. You shouldn't be meeting in other people's units to even have coffee or do those types of things. Social distancing truly is keeping away from other people and trying to stop the spread of those germs. Now, where this becomes very, very interesting is Section 40 of the Condominium Corporation Act says that you're supposed to have your AGM at least once in every 15 months. So the question I've gotten a lot of is, well, what will happen if we don't? Well, pursuant to section 40 sub 3, a unit owner can call a meeting by giving notice to the board and to the other unit owners. I don't see that as a huge risk in the circumstances that we're looking at. I don't see that as a big concern. The bigger of the two here is the corporation, pursuant to section 111 of the Condominium Property Act, can be fined up to $2,000 on a summary conviction for not holding an AGM, and that is specifically in there. Keep in mind that it's very unlikely the act was drafted with a pandemic in mind, or health and medical doctors telling us that we can't be around other people. So I find it very hard to believe, now again, this is my personal belief, but that a court would fault a condo corporation for making a reasonable postponement of a meeting in these circumstances. So yes, there is that risk there. I find it very hard that any of your owners would first report you for doing this and further go ahead to court to actually do that. However, that all being said, how you manage the situation surrounding the AGM, the communication that you're giving to your owners, the communication that the board has there, and keeping those lines of communication open is going to be key to avoiding those other things creeping up. If all of a sudden we just say we're not having the meeting and we don't give any idea, or we don't let any means of communication in, like send us questions, if you have a question, send us emails, or providing information to owners as to what's going on, you know, giving them some outlet. Because again, we've seen and we see over and over and over again, or I do in condos, once you shut off that tap to communication, something is going to, there is going to be a burst someplace down that pipe, and it will not be good. So make sure you're keeping the lines of communication open and going through that.
Yeah, and I mean, as a secondary comment with that, I don't know that I've ever heard of anyone being subject to a fine as it relates to a breach of that act. Not to say that that's a good reason to go and find a reason to do that, but I don't think it's something that they actively try to manage, and I think it would be more used in the extreme than anything, if at all.
Yeah, agreed.
So AGMs, what if you do want to go ahead? What does that look like? Can you have any electronic AGMs? So some people have been asking, you know, can we just broadcast it in a forum similar to this and try to have an AGM electronically? Well, different legislation across the country provides kind of different, very specific authorizations in favor or against having to do that, or being able to do that. Ours does not. However, there is some kind of generic language in section 47 that allows you to create bylaws related to the EGM, relating to voting. And so possibly if your bylaws had contemplated that as an outcome, you could have, you probably could have been able to have those. However, I haven't seen many bylaws, if any, that would have contemplated them. And there's been reasons why they might not be desired by some or by many, depending on the circumstances in the past. So I'd be surprised to find a lot of those bylaws.
I think
go ahead.
Just on that, Mark, looking at your community, I haven't come across, and I had to go searching, looking for bylaws that may allow for electronic meetings or phone meetings. I did actually find it in a commercial condo with 5 units. It was specifically contemplated because there was 5 units. So if you're looking at this in the future, you know, it's hindsight's 2020 by not having this there, but if you're looking at it, make sure you're looking at your specific community and all the logistics surrounding it.
Yeah, there's sometimes a very good reason to have a whole bunch of people in a room to kind of resolve those issues. And then there's also sometimes a reason why where maybe you've got nothing but non-resident owners, and this is going to be an opportunity to kind of bring people together in a different way. So absolutely give it some thought. We did come up with a solution though that would probably work for many of you, and that's just to use proxies in lieu of having kind of your ordinary AGM. So most bylaws will allow you to appoint a proxy. You could target a couple of individuals to be the proxies for a wide number of users, with kind of direction to vote on whatever specific issues you have going on with your condominium corporation. You could then have those, 2 or 3 people have an AGM, and use some sort of software like this just to authorize, others to view it remotely. There wouldn't be an opportunity to vote, but there would be an opportunity to kind of see what's going on and get the information sharing. But as noted, the decisions would be made by any of the appointed proxies.
So money is tight. What can we do and what can't we do? So this is changing. Money is a big concern right now. A lot of people are temporarily laid off or not knowing if they'll have jobs to come back to. The landscape is changing momentarily. It seems like, every time I look at the news or I look at the updates, either a new option has come out with respect to, the government is going to try give rebates. I know the city of Saskatoon is looking at a deferral for payment of water and utilities, but it would be a deferral. I don't know that that's going to help 6 months down the road. All of a sudden we have to pay for all of our utilities at that point. But there are, a lot of things changing very quickly. What you, for condo boards and what they have to look at is looking at everything with all of the information that they can have, not making knee-jerk reactions. So do not, you should and may need to amend your budget to look at things, because there's going to be very possibly some increased costs. There's going to be costs that were unexpected, increased cleaning, sanitation, other things that are going on. There may be a decrease in services. There may be a way when you shut down the pool, essentially you're not having things happening and you're not having those costs associated. So look at those items and look at your budget. You could consider changing the payment term of your assessment to allow for a delay in payments. I don't suggest this right now because you have to consider everything up front. It has to be offered equally, and I feel like right now it's too quick to determine or assess what you're actually going to be doing. So just making sure that if you are looking at those fees and delaying them or spreading them out, you are doing so in a manner that you've actually fully assessed the situation. Can I use the reserve fund? So section 55.3 and 61 of the Act restrict what the reserve fund can be used for. So section 55.3 does say, it's got to be major repairs or replacements. It's got to be, those big ticket items, but it also does have a category for unforeseen expenses. Unforeseen expenses, so your extra sanitation, those extra costs, that you could use your reserve fund for. If it's daily operation, like paying the electrical company because people aren't paying their condo fees, that's not an unforeseen expense. A couple slides ago, we talked about that section 111 and fines up to $2,000. There's only 6 sections in the Act that you can actually be fined for contravening, and misusing your reserve funds is one of those. Again, you have to do what you have to do to get by and to pay your bills. So I do suggest, if you're looking at these things, get professional advice, look at what is there, but know that, those extra costs, those unexpected costs, 100% you can look at your reserve fund for those. Just floating your daily operations, that is inappropriate in my view.
What can't we do? Well, you still need to comply with statutory obligations. So you can't stop managing the common property. So, you know, in that note, so to the extent that you've got a major repair or an issue that needs to be resolved, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those options with contractors coming on site, but to the extent that something has to be dealt with, to take care of some issues, you have to still do those things. You have to continue to enforce the bylaws. You can't stop to ensure that the property is adequately insured. And you shouldn't be avoiding registering liens through the enforcement process within the 90-day period. That kind of is the super priority over the mortgage and any other registered interest that is against the property. So, you know, again, granted that a lot of these things may, or the situation may create some financial hardship, you still have an obligation to ensure that the common property is being kind of taken care of and that you've got the funds to do it. And that includes enforcement mechanisms when need be.
Just on that last note there with the liens, distance yourself from your obligations and this being your neighbor and knowing that it's a hard time. You're not doing it to make it harder on them. You're doing it to protect the condo corporation and to protect the priority with respect to the mortgage and other things. So just take one hat off, and you know, it's easy to have that compassion, and essentially to that you're not doing this to make things more difficult. You're doing it for the protection of the corporation.
And on that note, I mean, it's one of those things that maybe if you have a clear and documented collection policy, that people are just aware of what the process is, that it takes some of that pressure off of you as a condominium corporation. So if you haven't kind of set out that, hey, by the way, if you get to this level of delay, we're going to start registering something against the title, then it becomes less of an issue over time. So. Estoppel certificates. Estoppel certificates are intended to be kind of a check-in on the financial and legal health of the condominium corporation. Obviously, both of these or both of those things may be affected by what's been happening with the coronavirus. And you know, the one thing, the major financial change in your organization, you know, who knows what that could be for you? I mean, whether or not you've got some major arrears, or maybe whether you've had to expend some significant funds and gotten to kind of a deficit position because of the fact that you don't have enough to deal with some of the new expenses that you're running into. Those would be good things to advise a new potential purchaser of, so that they don't come into it surprised and find out that, you know, you're backdating an assessment for you know, $2,000 because you needed it to deal with extra cleaning costs. Are you know, funding in accordance with the reserve fund study? Well, we mentioned you may be at that point dipping into the reserve fund study. It would be worth a qualification in that section of the estoppel to say, as a note, in 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, we used $30,000 of those funds in order to deal with, you know, I'm just using round whatever numbers, but $30,000 to deal with the additional cleaning costs or additional equipment costs that we require to maintain the property. Similarly, if you've missed any deadlines in accordance with the Act, the stuff that we've talked about around like AGMs, it would be helpful to at least note that we haven't had an AGM within the time frame listed in the Act. However, we endeavor to have one as soon as possible within, as soon as it's clear to do so, essentially.
So general sanitation guidelines, as Marc mentioned earlier, we are not experts in this area. Again, you see things changing all the time, but you need to look at, I read something yesterday and it hit home. Condos are like the fourth level of government, essentially. And you have to look at what is best for your owners and best for your building. So first and foremost, you are in charge of making rules and regulations regarding your common areas and those spaces. So looking at closing, if you have not already, your pool area or any common spaces that are open, you know, if you have a shuffleboard area or, you know, a common room, closing those areas off, making them inaccessible, closing down the gym, and, you know, taking steps with respect to your common areas and giving rules or putting rules in place. You're going to want to check in with suppliers and contractors with their processes to minimize spreading infection. It's going to result in increased cleaning, whether that's putting a bottle of hand sanitizer inside the elevator or outside the elevator when you get off of it, extra cleaning for those buttons, or suggesting that people, you know, use a cloth or Kleenex when getting in and out, trying to minimize essentially the spread of germs. Be respectful of owners' concerns. Everybody is in an unknown time. There's a lot of stress and unknown. Be respectful of owners' concerns and see if there are any mitigation strategies that can be used to alleviate some of those concerns.
Yeah, it's funny, I guess, on a lot of those notes. I've been, Jamie and I both follow a lot of condo lawyers across the country. And part of the presentation for sure was us kind of getting ideas from different places that we've seen. And to see some of the different approaches and techniques, sometimes with larger apartment style condos especially, but things like making sure that there was a limit in terms of the number of people that could go in the elevator at any specific time. Having a location that you could have couriers drop off items, and then there was one condo in particular, I think was a fairly large one, where they'd have someone, a concierge that was wiping them down and then making them sit there for a period of time, and then they would deliver them up to the unit just to minimize some of the transmission back and forth. That might not be right for you, but you should be turning your mind to how do we minimize some of these things that we have been told in various channels to make sure that we are taken care of, and to assess that in terms of especially the high traffic areas in your properties, the entrances, the exits, the elevators, mail rooms, you know, is all those types of things that you should be considering and making sure that you're spending some extra attention to. The other thing to think about with some of these things, and we'll get a little bit into this later with some of the communication pieces, is this might be something, especially if you've got a whole bunch of people that are staying home for periods of time, you might consider creating a volunteer committee to deal with this instead of incurring additional costs through your property manager. So maybe, and I don't know if there's issues with that in terms of some of the contracts that maybe the property managers have, but it's something to consider is if there's a way for you to help out within your community in a way that could save some costs or minimize some of the extra hardship that you're going to be going through. Actually, before we get to this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about this one with, I got a lot of questions about snowbirds in terms of what that looks like and what the obligations are of the condominium corporation as it relates to snowbirds. As we know, there's been a lot of travel or restrictions for isolating and self-isolating based on people that are coming from out of the country. The important thing to note with those things, a couple of things. One, it is not your responsibility to police that. So, you know, you don't have the ability or the obligation to make sure that Frank isn't leaving his unit, and that if he does, that, you know, you're going to push them back into it or restrain them or whatever the case may be. You have no ability to kind of restrain them from entering into the common property. What you can do is kind of communicate with them about some of these things. And that's maybe the latter part, is talking about some of the communication strategies that we're going to suggest. You do have, I mean, there is going to likely be in the coming days and weeks, maybe some mechanisms by which you're reporting things to authorities if you feel that that's something that you need to do in your circumstances because you feel that individuals are being unsafe. That would be a different issue. But in terms of kind of your own personal police force at the condominium corporation, it's just not a good idea. Any other thoughts?
Just on that, you know, you may come up with a strategy, and we're going to touch on communication in a minute, but you may come up with a strategy that works for people. So if those people want to self-identify, and I see there's a question here about taking garbage out and that sort of thing. I, very quick off the hop, was in contact with a confirmed case and had to self-isolate. And it's amazing what the community around you does, dropping off groceries on your step. I have a house, but outside your condo door, if you put your garbage out, somebody will take it for you. There's phones and telecommunication in other ways. So as long as people are willing to self-identify, that might include putting a sign up, that might on their door, that might be whatever it may be. But the one thing that I'm loving that is coming out of all of the bad that is going on and then the fear and the negativity is so much community is also coming out, and people are helping each other and supporting each other and doing what they can, except for hoarding toilet paper.
True. That was really one particular issue, bylaw enforcement. I drafted an article, I don't know, probably a couple of weeks ago on my website, talking about a recent decision that came out of Alberta. It was a final decision of a injunction on a condo owner that was using his property as a Airbnb rental. So in condos especially, kind of interprovincial decisions sometimes aren't super helpful because the legislation is so different from province to province that there might be something else going on there. In this case, the Alberta decision has a lot of the same legislation that impacts kind of what we're doing here in terms of some of the language. So I think it's probably a little more instructive in that sense. But essentially what the court had determined in that case was that when you're renting out your property in Airbnb as a very short-term rental, that it is more akin to a license for the use of the property than it is a lease. And when you change the nature of the relationship from lease to license, it's no longer something that's restricted by our act, which kind of restricts cannot restrict the devolution or lease or transfer of any kind of interest in the condo is the language in the act. The same kind of language that shows up in the Alberta decision. So in essence, there's a very strong authority that says that you can, as a condo board or as a condo corporation, restrict Airbnb by having a restriction from someone operating a business within their condo, which I think is an issue that many have been struggling with. And I think right now struggling with even more, given the temporary nature of someone coming in and someone coming out of their property. And so there has been, this would be one of those areas that if you hadn't been that stringent on in the past and you feel that you need to be, that you would definitely maybe get some legal advice on how to proceed with that. But you want to probably pay some attention to that to avoid some of the transmission risks of having random people coming and going all the time within the property. Also, you might, if you don't have that kind of bylaw in place, which to be fair, most do, you might want to consider kind of a general board resolution that directs that Airbnb be temporarily suspended, just out of maybe a general right to manage and govern the common property, insofar that you are directing kind of a short-term policy that disallows that from happening, and maybe if not, as kind of a punitive function associated with it, that there may be increased cleaning or some costs that would be passed along to those Airbnb unit owners. As a result of it. Again, all that stuff requires some legal advice in terms of how to implement it, and we're always here and happy to help.
So we've touched on it a little bit, but information sharing, first and foremost, make sure that you have electronic means of contacting everyone. So telephone, email, other ways, essentially, rather than paper under their door or posting of paper in the elevators or otherwise. Make sure you have a way to contact your owners. Consider creating lists of individuals that could use some additional assistance. Again, those who are willing to assist and those who need assistance, this is again by self-identification. Please do not start, as touched on earlier, essentially outing your neighbor. You were on a trip and I am going to follow you and I'm just going to put a sign on your door telling everybody else in the complex that you were. If that person wants to self-identify or add their name to a list or otherwise, but make sure that you are essentially being respectful of privacy concerns of other owners. But if people are self-identifying and you keep that line of communication open, so you ask people to identify if they have been in contact or if they have a concern, or if they need help and they want to be added or they want to essentially put up a sign outside their door, then that is fair game. But just make sure you are watching and it is with consent. All of that, of course, balanced with, if you have a real concern, there now is law in Saskatchewan that people can and should be reported if they are knowingly out and doing things that are wrong, essentially going out into the public and that sort of thing, if they are supposed to be in quarantine. So you have to balance that with that obligation under the new law that we have. But again, being respectful and doing things, use your best, essentially do what a reasonable person would do in that circumstance.
The good old lawyer test. So yeah, I think this kind of repeats a lot of the same sort of things, but you can ask owners, again, to volunteer information about your health status. I think that's particularly important if you ever got into an emergency situation. It might be that emergency personnel might have some desire to know if they're going into a situation like that. But if you're going to be collecting that list, it has to be absolutely confidential unless you have consent to share with the community at large or to use it in some other way. So you want to be explicit about those things. You want to make sure that you're advising your owners as to any restrictions in the common spaces, any delivery restrictions, any enhanced cleaning that needs to be done, anything that you feel is appropriate or necessary to ensure that you guys are getting through this in the best way possible. Maybe on a slightly lighter note, you should consider to find a way to kind of build your community through this too. And I think just as kind of a lighthearted way to look at it, to do a virtual coffee time with some of your co-owners. My firm, we just did this for the first time this morning. It was a good test to see which of my partners could use technology with minimal instructions. Many failed, but many also participated, so it was good to see. At-home cocktail parties or coffee hours. I'm currently going to be having a murder mystery party with 15 of my friends on Zoom on Saturday. I have no idea how it's going to work, but I'm hopeful that it's going to be fun, and it's going to be a little more social than kind of what I've been experiencing with just me and my kids and my wife. And another thought we had was just about exercising outdoors, well, kind of exercising proper social distancing. So it's right now that in particular I think is kind of an evolving thought. We've started to see things like parks being shut down and other areas. So I mean, again, don't follow our advice for how to be properly social distancing, but consider some of those things as ways so you can approach your community in a different way.
Pick up some new skills and hobbies. I heard today that the liquor store might start delivering. But no, in all honesty, try to look at other things that you could do from home. All of those projects that you've been putting off, the book that you haven't been reading, or things that you've wanted to learn, like a second language. Look at other things that are there. And honestly, those governance issues that you've been putting aside, like your bylaws and looking at your rules and regulations, you've got lots of time, and your board can meet via telephone or Zoom to work on those things that have been sitting on the shelves.
I think that's the end of what we had. Oh yeah, key. I'll let you.
So essentially, the key takeaway to all of this, in my view, and I know there's going to be a lot of questions here, but the key thing is condo boards acting in good faith and applying ordinary reasonable care, diligence, and skill, not knee-jerk reactions that will lead to situations or problems down the road, will be better suited to defend any of their actions going forward. So just keep in mind, you're acting in good faith, applying ordinary reasonable care. Key, seek professional advice on your specific circumstances, because each and every one of you has nuances or differences in your bylaws. You also might have differences with respect to different people that have certain immune compromised situations or other specifics, how your condo is set up, how you get in and out. There are specifics. So there is no one size fits all here. Get professional advice on your specific circumstances and bylaws.
Yeah, and I mean, aside from specifically the legal advice, I mean, the health advice and all those other pieces. I mean, the public health has been trying to, I think, share as much information as possible, and to the extent that they can support you in what's going on, I'm sure they'd be happy to do so. Obviously, given the challenges and the amount of requests and information that they've been sought after. So look for those resources. A lot of them are online. Like I said, we'll do our best to kind of share information as we come to know it. So I think that's the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to go back to our lovely mugs and just look at questions. So I'll go to the Q&A first. We talked a little bit about the tenant under quarantine. Should they take their garbage out or to a shared garbage bin? Yeah, so I mean, if you've got a situation where you do have someone under quarantine, I think the short answer to that is look at kind of aggressively safe techniques to make sure that transmission isn't going to happen. So it might be that, there's a protocol where they leave their garbage outside. Someone comes by with some gloves and an extra bag and puts it in there and takes it out for them. Maybe there's a process in terms of if they need to go outside, that they, use specific exits or they use specific gear to make sure that they're minimizing their likelihood of transmission. Just make sure that if you get those cases that you're communicating with them as much as possible. So what if the maintenance company, that has provided exercise equipment maintenance has decided not to provide services at this time, so we can't fix the equipment? I would say that probably if you're dealing with exercise equipment, you're probably dealing with an environment that probably shouldn't be going right now anyway. A lot of those gym type facilities should have been shut down just as a general rule. My suggestion would be to wait until that is kind of removed, and then at that point, kind of open up from there. So, is it okay to keep laundry areas open or just clean? Jamie, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about this one because I saw this pop up. If that is your only way to have that laundry area, so you don't have in-suite laundry and you don't have any other way to clean your clothes, I think that that's essential. You may want to look at trying to schedule so people aren't coming and crossing paths in the laundry room, or trying to set up further cleaning. So you will, once you use the laundry, then you wipe it down, and you know, certain precautions are put in place. So I think you need to take steps around that laundry area, but you probably need to keep it open because people are going to need to clean their clothes if there's no other way to do that.
Let's just see. Short-term is long-term tenancy any different than a short-term Airbnb? Both are businesses. Yeah, they're different. Once the distinction that was in the decision was more around whether or not it was a lease or a license. So a lease, I think they were contemplating, 30 days or more, something where you have, a lease actually has an interest in land at that point, whereas a license is not an interest in land. So really we're talking about the short-term Airbnb type arrangements where you're operating almost akin to a hotel. That's what the decision was commenting on.
There's a question here about comment as to walking when you're in self-isolation after returning from a trip. If you're in self-isolation after returning from a trip, that's gonna, in my view, and again, this is my personal view, and we're seeing stuff daily because I seen a news article on this recently, because people aren't walking, they meet people to go for a walk with, or otherwise, or you're in a park or other places where you're running into people. Now, if you're walking while in self-isolation, in my case, where I could walk out the front door and not be in an elevator or common hallway or otherwise, and I walk and ensure that I'm, far away from other people, I personally think that that would not be offside. But again, I stand to be corrected by the health officials and what they say, and what is evolving daily. If you're talking about going for a walk when you're in self-isolation and you're on the 13th floor of a apartment style condo, no, you can't go for a walk, because you shouldn't be getting in the elevator, you shouldn't be going down the stairs, you shouldn't be in that close contact. So that's my view.
Yeah, I was looking at this a little bit before the presentation because we had seen so many of these questions, and again, I think this is something that they're trying to provide some direction and clarity on. One thing that I noted when I was looking through, kind of, they were talking about the process when you're coming back into the country. The quarantine, the self-isolation was, yeah, there's a possibility that you were affected because you were in a region or you're in proximity to someone. The quarantine, I think, was more a situation where you were actually displaying symptoms coming from an area in which that was the case. And one of the restrictions that they would put on you was that you'd have to have a place that would keep you away from individuals that would be sensitive to some of the health issues that would come up. So, those with immunocompromised or the elderly or the like, which creates some obvious concerns for those who are resident in a condo. The opportunity, or what the information item said, was that if you didn't have a place to go, that they would essentially direct you to a quarantine facility maintained by Government of Canada, which I don't know what. I know I was reading an article about the people coming back from China and that they were being isolated in some military base in Ontario. I don't know what that looks like, or if we're at that point in terms of having some of those additional facilities prepared, but that's probably the distinction between the two. Comment about laundry room again, just that you have 24 units in a common laundry room. How do we maintain social distancing and cleanliness? Again, I would say look at probably a schedule would be my suggestion in terms of making sure that you've got with some specific time or whatever works for your particular unit, whether it be maybe booking it out or something like that. And again, some additional heightened cleaning techniques associated with it. Again, talk to the experts because it'll be in terms of some of those specific issues. Flying from Toronto to Regina require self-isolation? I think that they've extended it to interprovincial.
I don't think they have yet, but there's been talk about it. But I could be wrong. There is discussion about it, but I don't think it's official yet.
Yeah. Recording will be made available for all those who are acting. Yeah, self-isolation after travel is under the Quarantine Act. Shouldn't people not be going out at all, period? Yeah, shouldn't they? Yeah, that's probably right. But I think there's going to be, I can't tell you the technical description of what they're requiring as part of that. I don't know that I've seen a really great document that has assisted that either. So I'm going to go back to the webinar chat to see if there's anything in there that we haven't talked about. The AGM, we talked a little bit about that. What we were talking about before the presentation, Jamie and I, was just about, having a town hall style meeting. So not one necessarily with kind of a legal effect to it, but maybe an opportunity for people to raise some concerns and have a conversation with one another in kind of the format that we've been doing here. So that might be something to as part of the strategy to avoid having the AGM, is just to make sure that you're kind of increasing that communication in some of that way. Anything else in here that you saw?
This presentation will be available after. It will be circulated, and you can circulate it. I've seen a few questions about that. It will be out there for and available essentially.
And like I said, the isolation requirements, I've been seeing a lot of information that's getting passed from different levels of government, and just to kind of pay attention to that. That stuff is going to be updated on the every day probably, in terms of until they get a real handle on the problem in a way that suggests they've managed it properly. So, I wouldn't say rely on necessarily this webinar for what the definition of that. We're going to see better information pieces coming out of the province and out of the federal government on a daily basis.
With respect to the last question there, is there an obligation to release those documents discussed at the AGM prior to actually holding the AGM? Again, you're going to have to look at your specific circumstance. I think if you're waiting for the AGM, I don't think you need to circulate it now. You may want to circulate it now in the to keep things open and to keep those communications open. But depending on your specific situation, if it's going to confuse owners, if you're going to just leave them with more questions than answers, then it may not. So you're going to have to look at, again, are we doing a telephone chat? And so we put these year-end financials in front of everybody and we talk about them, and then we either hold the meeting later or we hold it via proxy, as Mark discussed earlier. So you're going to have to look at all of those things and nothing in isolation.
Okay. Well, I think we covered most of what people have been asking about. I'm hoping that was helpful. If there's any questions that you guys have, again, feel free to reach out to Jamie or myself. My email address, mkelly, M-K-E-L-L-Y @ktlp.ca. Jamie?
My email, JHERLE@CUELENAERE.com.
You've picked the two firms with complicated email addresses. Awesome.
A lot of E's there.
Google.
I'm just going to put my email address in the comments as well, in case there.
So yeah, that was great, everybody. If there's more information to share, or if there's some value in doing it again, we'll consider absolutely having another webinar. But again, reach out if you've got any further questions. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.